welcome. This is a 6-week course, or at least in 6 sessions. It requires a lot of homework. The more you put into it, the more you will get out of it. The strength of the course is in what you learn from the Psalms. And the course is there just to guide you through that learning process, not to do it for you. Why would I call a course like this for the healing of the nations? Many of you perhaps will recognize where that phrase comes from. It comes from the book of Revelation, and it speaks of the leaves of the tree of life being for the healing of the nations. Well, what is this tree of life, and what are its leaves? The image in the right-hand corner of the slide is by Marc Chagall, one of the many images he did of the tree of life. In this case, emphasizing the leaves of the tree of life. In the first psalm, that tree is mentioned, and it says that its leaves do not wither. So that's why I have chosen this particular title for the course, because not only do we have a medicine, but the nations need to be healed. And over the next 6 weeks or 6 sessions, if you're doing this in a compressed form, I hope that is what we will begin to learn. And so I would repeat what I said at the beginning. You really can't learn this from me, because I'm involved in, as we all are, in complicity in the illness that we need healing from. But nonetheless, the healing is possible. At the beginning of each session, there is a selection of music. The music's optional. You can click on the link and play the YouTube component. You may want to minimize it if it turns out that there's some advertising, or else close the advertising. Music has been an expression of the Psalms, of course, throughout the last 3,000 years. And we will do just a few selections. The opening one, in a strange language, perhaps to some of you, Jehovah quam multis sunt hostes mei, is by Henry Purcell. We will look at language in this course, but for the most part, we're working in our native tongue, English. But do listen to this marvelous piece of music. Let me first address the question, why did I study the Psalms? If another teacher is giving this course, please feel free to insert your own reasons. I went to a conference at St. Andrews University in Scotland in 2006, where I was very interested in the Epistle to the Hebrews. I had been studying it in gory detail, but I hadn't realized that there's a conversation in the epistle between the Father and the Son. And I hadn't realized that 95% of that conversation, as recorded in the Epistle to the Hebrews, is taken from the Psalms. I knew immediately that I had to learn to read the Psalms as they were first written, so that I could begin to understand how Jesus would have read those Psalms within the knowledge that he learned of their history and the history of Israel in his own human life. So I began to read with the poets and to hear the sound of their voices. And I began to hear also, in fact, very loudly, God's reply. I can say in the spaces between the words of the poems, but they came more than spaces. They came in absolute presence in my life personally for every psalm that I read. These poems are dangerous, I said at the time. If there was a flood, there was a flood in my house. If I needed to learn penitence, I knew my own stupidity with shame. Shame is a very, very important part of what we will learn through the Psalms. There it is, a little bit of introduction. I have never been disappointed in the years that I have read these. And my readings refresh and redeem all the singing that I have done throughout my life of these same poems. We're not going to do the whole course in the next 5 minutes. It's a long learning process. Today we will look at section 1. What is the Psalter? When was it written? Who for? Why? And a little bit about how to read the Psalms. Next week, or next session, we'll look at translation. Translation is more fun than a barrel of monkeys, so get ready to think about language in all that we're doing over the next 6 sessions. In the 3rd session, we'll look at the whole and see whether there are major structures within the whole that can allow us to understand the context of each of the poems as far as where they are placed within the whole story. In the 4th session, we will look at the characters and see if we can identify with them. We'll look at the way in which the Psalms are used in the New Testament and how they are used by Jesus. In the 5th session, we'll talk about our own discipline of reading, of how to ask, of how to hear, of God's acts, and of prayer. In the 6th session, we'll look at the new song and the old song. We'll look at music, we'll look at punctuation, we'll look at how we can move into our lives and give to the next generation and to all those whom we meet the gifts that we will receive from the Psalter. I have suggested the following format for each session. It's very important, even if you're doing this work in a small group or even alone, that you do the homework. This is not a matter of learning from a lecturer. The music, 5 minutes of music, will do something for you that a lone voice cannot do. The introductory lecture, I will certainly do my homework also and try to lead you into this marvelously treed forest, this marvelous gallery of images, which is the Psalter. We will read one or more psalms in every session. We'll do a workshop. You should have a piece of paper in front of you with the psalm text on it so you can read it and try and draw the connections in the text yourself and develop your own questions. And then if you have a copy of Seeing the Psalter, you can use the tables in the text for that psalm to confirm that you've made some of the connections that are in the text itself. We'll have a short break. Everybody needs a break after an hour's work, and then come back together to discuss the questions and to prepare the homework for the following week. If we're doing this week by week, I hope the next 6 weeks will get you into the habit of reading 1 or 2 psalms every day. I've been reading them now just about every day, not always with great discipline, for 7 or 8 years. And I still don't have them from memory, although I have snippets of memory everywhere. There are only 150 of them, but it's a very, very substantial piece of work. It's a substantial handle on history and the gospel in one book. So let's get to our first questions for this first session. What is a psalter? I have had people do a double take when I say the word. Strictly speaking, the book of Scripture that I want us to see is called the Psalms. And a psalter is a book containing these psalms. I only figured this out after I'd written the book, but I think people knew what I meant if they knew what a psalter was. So the psalter is comprised of 5 books of poetry, together containing 150 psalms. There are many translations from the original Hebrew, more than one in Greek, many more than one in Latin, and many in English. It is a book that has been loved in every generation, and more could be said on this, but I want to move on to other questions. So when were these psalms written? Well, you can see I've extracted some dates from the Jerusalem Bible, 1962, and there are several books out there that one could use, such as the Psalms Through 3,000 Years by William Holiday from 1993, or the more recent Blackwell commentary, the Psalms Through the Centuries by Susan Gillingham. We'll start about 3,000 years ago in the time of David, roughly 1,000 before the Common Era. We'll come through the period of the separation of the 2 kingdoms into the north and the south, and the conquest of Samaria by the Assyrians in 721 BCE. We'll come through to the fall of the Davidic Jerusalem line in 587, and finally through to the building of the Second Temple after the Restoration in 520 to 515 BCE, and into the period of the Restoration at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. It's a long period of time, about as long as we would have in English poetry from Chaucer through to T.S. Eliot. So there's a lot of history in the period, and the major component of it is the exile to Babylon in the period from 587 to the later part of that century. These are kind of big questions. Who wrote them? Who did they write them for? And why were they written? We can't again answer that with a short answer. It's probable that there were many specific occasions, perhaps a particular liturgical act, perhaps a wedding, or perhaps a pilgrimage. They would have been written perhaps in times of joy or in times of trouble. Certainly, some of them were written during the exile and perhaps after the exile at the time of the Restoration. They may have been written for the king, or they may have been written for the people. In several of the Psalms, it would seem they were written for all who fear God. And ultimately, I think they were written for us who believe that it is God who teaches through the Psalms. Certainly, they were written within a covenant. And the covenant continues over a period of many years. Now, they were not only written, they were also collected. And how were they collected? And not so much who collected them, but why did the persons or person who collected them place them in particular places within the sequence that we now find them in. There's a long history to that sequence, I am sure. Many starts and stops. But the sequence that we have now is quite remarkable. And in particularly, we can see an envelope into which the whole 150 Psalms work or fit. Psalm 149 hints at the purpose of the Psalms, and it has very strong relations to Psalm 2, which itself has very strong relations to Psalm 1. So there's a kind of an outer envelope for the 147 Psalms that are between those two, and perhaps you could put Psalm 150 on the outside of the envelope, as if to say, start here if you don't know any better. But do, by all means, open the envelope and read them. And think about those sovereigns, as I've called them here, or kings, as they would be in earlier translations. These are ones who perhaps don't know mercy at the beginning, but will know mercy at the end. And how will they learn it? Let's see, by beginning to read one ourselves. So I'm not beginning with one of the beginning or ending poems. I'm beginning with the one that follows the opening two poems, Psalm 3, which, if you listen to the earlier music, we just heard. Now, I've just put all the text in front of you. Lord, how are they increased that trouble me? Many are they that rise against me. Multi insurgunt contra me. Many are they that say of my soul, there's no help for him in his God. But thou, O Lord, art my defender. Thou art my worship and the lifter up of my head. I did call upon the Lord with my voice, and he heard me out of his holy hill. I laid me down and slept, and rose up again. For the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid for the increase of 10,000s of the people that have set themselves against me round about. Up, Lord, and help me. Surge Jehovah, and help me, O my God, for thou smitest all mine enemies upon the cheekbone. Thou hast broken the teeth of the ungodly. Salvation belongeth unto the Lord, and thy blessing is upon thy people. So there we had a block of text. It's a bit easier to read and to see if we put some carriage returns in. And it's not expensive anymore because we're not wasting paper, just screen area. Also, that particular psalm left out the inscription, which in the Hebrew numbering is always verse 1. A psalm of David. And the occasion is given when he ran away from the face of Absalom, his son. Adonai, how multiplied my straits. Many arise over me. Many say of me, there's no salvation for him in God. Selah. But you, Adonai, a shield about me, my glory, and lifting high my head. My voice to Adonai I call, and he answers me from his holy hill. Selah. I lie down and I sleep. I awake, for Yahweh supports me. I will not fear the multiplicity of people that set over me. Arise, Adonai, save me, my God, for you strike all my enemies on the cheek. The teeth of the wicked you break. Of Adonai is the salvation. On your people, your blessing. Selah. So there we have two very different translations. One traditional and my own close translation of the Hebrew. Quite literal. I'll talk more about the translation in our next session. The first thing I want to show you is the way in which the psalmist uses words by repeating them within the poem. Some of these repetitions are quite strategic. First of all, notice that I have circled 6 repetitions of the holy name, the tetragrammaton, Yod, He, Vav, He, not pronounced in Jerusalem after the exile. And we have an indication of that because the Greek translation substitutes the word Lord for the holy name. And that's what I said in the Hebrew, Adonai. Some would say Hashem, or some would have the Lord, as you have in the King James Version, with the small capital letters, indicating the presence of God's name as revealed to Moses. This name occurs 6 times in this psalm, spread throughout the poem. So it is the beginning of an adoration of this God. Now, if we go to the next slide, we will see some other words that are repeated. In verses 2 and 3, we have multiplied, arise, salvation, and God repeated in sequence in verses 7 and 8. The poem has this structure of 4 words repeated, and repeated only here, and repeated in the same order. And so they show in the table as 2 parallel lines. If they had been repeated in reverse order, and we might often see this, they would show in the table as an arrowhead. When you get a repetition like this, you might often want to look in the middle, because the repetition surrounds something that is significant. Here it is that Adonai is my shield, my glory, who lifts high my head. And also we have in verse 6 a central verse, which we'll see on the next slide. I lie down and I sleep. I awake, for Yahweh supports me. You'll notice I've stuck a little hat. In the English, I use an uppercase 6. In the Hebrew, the hat occurs below the last letter in the line. And it's called an atanach, and it shows the midpoint of a verse. This particular notation is very ancient, older even than the vowel pointing of the Hebrew text. No one is quite sure how old it is, and we'll look at it in more detail in the 6th session. Another, and I put this secondary because I think it is secondary, and this is where I differ from recent scholarship. Another very important part of reading the poetry is parallelism. Parallelism is where the same thing is said in different words. The first thing I showed you is where the same word is repeated multiple times. But parallelism is very important. It locks in the meaning for us. It has a kind of vertical grammar that teaches us how to read. But notice this one. It's a game. For you strike all my enemies on the cheek. The teeth of the wicked you break. You see, it's a reverse parallel. It is a circular structure in its conceptual form, and in the repeated words, we'll also find circular structures through them. What we have here, the enemies and the wicked, refer back to the troubles that David was in. The tsarai, the what I call straits in the first verse, and what we have, the hostes, or the enemies of the Latin translation, or adversaries. There are enemies, troubles, straits, and adversaries everywhere in the Psalms, even in that most calm green pasture of Psalm 23, the most remembered psalm, at least in recent English history, where it says, "You arrange, facing me in my presence, a table in front of my adversaries." I didn't use presence, in the presence of my adversaries, because I reserve that word present, which is actually the word face in the Hebrew. Face and presence I take together, but in front of, neged, my adversaries. It's a different word in the Hebrew. Anyway, I'm getting carried away with translation before I should. So the tables will help us to see repeated words without going into Psalm 11 in detail right now, because our head is full of Psalm 3. But we do have here again the wicked and the upright and the righteous and the righteous and the wicked and the upright. And what we see is that those words recur in reverse sequence, and they surround something. They surround something different. In this case, don't worry, folks. The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord is in the heavens, his throne. He is the ruler. Things are going to work out because he is the ruler, and we know him. And he loves the upright. There we are. Be cool. Yeah, lots of enemies, but we're not in that much trouble. So, I'll sum up 3 techniques. You might have only seen 2, but the first one was important, putting in the carriage returns. We had 3 techniques: parallelism, prosody, and recurrence. And we can show them with the first verse of Psalm 1. It works out to have 3 statements. That's a division of by 2 and by 3 by putting in carriage returns. It works out to have a complex parallel, walking in the advice of the wicked, in the way of sinners not standing, in the seat of the scornful not sitting, a kind of A, B, B, A, B, A, where you have an action and a place. The English translation here completely mirrors the shape of the Hebrew. And we also have repeated words. In the Hebrew, lo, lo, lo. No, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. Repeated. So there's recurrence, parallelism, and arranging the text so that we can see it. Now, enough lecturing from me. We come to our first exercise. This is really the end of the formal lecture and the beginning of your work as you come to grips with the techniques that I have suggested for reading the poems. You will also notice that Psalms 1 and 2 are one poem, not 2. And yet, they probably were written several hundred years apart. One is old, one is new, but they were very carefully put together. And their togetherness is very evident from the repeated words that are used within them. Sometime later, and I remind you, you've done a lot of hard work now getting into those first 2 Psalms, and the work needs to continue. Do give yourself rest, though. Much of what you learn while you're asleep. Our homework is to look at what I call the Psalms at the seams. The Psalter is comprised of 5 books. They're all contained, with the exception of 150, between 1 and 2 and 149 as a kind of envelope. Book 1 ends with Psalm 40 and 41. And I put Psalm 40 in there because I want you to recognize that Book 2 ends with Psalm 70, and it is about 3 or 4 verses taken from Psalm 40. And it raises the first question, why are there duplicates within the Psalter? We'll come back to that. Book 2 ends with Psalm 70 through 72. Book 3 then begins with 73 and ends with 89. Book 4 begins with 90, and it has a mirrored prayer in 102, and it ends with 106. I didn't put in the opening of Book 5, Psalm 107, though you're certainly welcome to read that as well, because I thought we had enough. Those seams will give us the beginning of an insight into the substance of the book of Psalms. So please read 2 Psalms each day and enjoy them always.